Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw a Cavalier King Charles in pastels. Now this video is going to primarily focus on how to draw longer, silkier fur, but before I get onto that I always like to start with the eye. Now when I'm working on an eye that has a bright reflection like this, I will always use my white Carbothello first just to block in my lightest value. I can then always darken it up later on if I need to. Now in the reference photo, the pupils of the eyes were quite small because of how the lighting was catching the eyes. This is something that I did come back in later on and just change based on the other photographs of the dog that I was then later provided. But when I started working on the base layer here, as you can see, when I'm working with my pan pastels, I'm just purely blocking in my main lights and darks. I'm not focusing on getting that layer there as dark or as light as it needs to be. That's something that I want to achieve with my pencils. But the pan pastel layer here just tells me exactly where all of those main shapes should go. Now when I start working on fur that has a vibrancy to it, like the orange markings on the face, I want to be making sure that I've always got good colour saturation. Now this is one aspect of the real-time tutorial that I focus on thoroughly, because if we were to darken those areas at the wrong layer and add those darker values too soon, then that colour can end up very muddy very quickly when working with pastels. Now as I've built up my foundation here ready to start adding in my details, you can see that I'm already focusing on the fur direction. Now this is something that I feel is really important, and it goes alongside with the placement of the highlights and shadows. Now the fur direction and the placement of the lights and darks isn't random, it follows the underlying bone and muscular structure. So for example here with this orange marking, you can see that it curves over the top of the eye, and that's indicating at the eye socket the shape of the skull. So this is all something that I really do want to focus on when I'm aiming for that high level of realism. Now when drawing softer fur, the values are really important. So in order to create that softness, the midtones are what we want to focus on just as much as the lights and the darks. Now at that base foundation stage, it's very tempting to jump into those lighter highlights, those details that we notice first when we look at the reference photo, but we do want to leave those for our later layers. Now quite often if the fur doesn't look as soft as we would like, it's because there isn't as many of those midtones captured. So focusing on that stage before adding the highlights can make a real difference. Now something that I also like to focus on and is really important when drawing fur is fur length. So as you can see under the eye here, my pencil strokes are significantly shorter than the fur on the top of the head. This is where we need to be looking at that reference photo and noticing all of these changes. Now when I start working on the ear, this again is where I'm going to be adjusting my pencil strokes. So the fur is significantly longer, and this is where that fur has that softer appearance. I really want to be making sure that I've captured that. Now just like when I worked on the face, I'm using my pan pastels basically just to block in my main lights and darks. Now when drawing spaniel ears, this is one of the more complex sections of this kind of portrait. The way that the fur overlaps and the thickness of that fur can be quite overwhelming to capture. Now to make sure that I simplify the process as much as possible in my real-time tutorials, I'm really breaking it up into individual layers. If I focus on individual layers and then those smaller sections, it's far less overwhelming. Now when I work on something like this where the fur is that much longer and it is overlapping different areas, I actually like to block in more of a larger area than I typically would if the fur was shorter. This is only because that fur is overlapping in so many different sections that it makes it easier to visualise that when you do see that whole area drawn in. So as you can see here, these longer pencil strokes, they start off at the midsection of the ear, but they overlap right down to the lower part. I'm only able to create those natural pencil strokes if I've got that lower section mapped in. This is one of those occasions where I will actually work on a larger area than I typically would anywhere else on the portrait. And again, these are those lighter highlights, so I didn't jump into this value, I've built up those mid-tone stages first. This is so important no matter what fur that we're drawing. Now in my tutorials I do mention the importance of drawing the right layer at the right time, and this lower part of the ear is not finished. The very longest sections of the fur at the bottom there do overlap the chest, so I need to make sure that the chest is drawn in first before I can finish the ear. Now I did want to get the rest of the face drawn in, so I'll come back in and finish the ear later on. Now something that's really important with any art, no matter if it's a landscape, a portrait, whatever it may be, is lighting. Now if you've got a strong one-sided light source, there's going to be shadows that are darker on one side of the face and highlights that are going to be brighter on the other side of the face. This is something that we really do want to be capturing because that will help with that three-dimensional look of the drawing. Now if you don't have a photograph that has a one-sided light source and it's a bit more of a general light source, then it's still important to make sure that we don't add highlights or shadows where they don't need to be. Now going back to something that I mentioned at the beginning of the video regarding the placement of the highlights and shadows, if we start adding extra highlights or shadows where they shouldn't be, then we will end up changing the shape and form of that animal. And of course that therefore won't resemble as much of that pet or that animal as it should. So this is something that we really want to be paying very close attention to. Now I've got lots of videos here on YouTube where I'm showing many different fur textures and fur colours. I've also got a video where I'm sharing my top tips for drawing realistic fur in pastels. I'll link that in the description below if it's of interest. But the pencil technique and how we're building up these details are so important. I want to also be focusing on how to create the right thickness of those pencil strokes. This is going to have an impact on the texture of the fur that's being drawn. So for example, the fur around the nose here, I want to be making sure that I've got my details nice and short, that they must be going in the right direction, but also that my pencil strokes are the right thickness. Now if I make my pencil strokes too thick here, then it's going to lose that fine, shorter hair appearance. So it's all about monitoring whether or not that pencil needs to have lighter pressure, whether or not we need to work with a sharper point, how we hold and move that pencil. These are all aspects that I cover in my real-time tutorials. Because I'm recording them with a voiceover while I'm drawing, I'm able to explain everything in the moment. It makes even the most complex subjects more of a step-by-step tutorial. Now if you are interested in any of my real-time lessons, then I'll link all of the information to that in the description below. But as always, if you do have any art-related questions or something that you're stuck on, a specific technique maybe, then feel free to pop any questions in the comments and I'm more than happy to help if I can. Now as I'm starting to build up more of my pencil layers here, you can see that my base foundation is actually very light. This is going to vary depending on how bright the white fur is in any reference photo that I'm working from. And I've got lots of examples of white fur tutorials here on YouTube. Now if you do have white fur that's got more of a darker look to it, then you can work with a bit more of a darker base foundation. But this really is going to depend on the lighting, the fur texture, there's many different factors. But the one consideration is I don't want to make that area too dark. I want to always be making sure that I've got the white fur as light as it needs to be. So whether or not I come back in and darken it up later on is something that again is going to vary depending on that reference photo. But I want to be making sure that I have got the contrast right. Now contrast is something that I talk about in all tutorials. The importance of having those bright highlights and dark shadows is what I feel makes a portrait look more three-dimensional. Of course, colour selection and what colours we should be using are also important, but I just feel that the contrast and the values is something that adds more depth to the painting or the drawing compared to the exact colours. Now the colour selection process is again something that I do focus all of my real-time tutorials on. I use a very simple colour wheel system to help identify which pencils we should be using. But here at this base layer, for example, I'm focusing on where the lighter areas are, those darker sections, and then some of those subtle midtones. I have added in a little bit more of a yellower, yellow ochre tint to this layer, and I'm going to influence that colour as I work here. But it's the lights and the darks that's going to help build up the depth. I could have the colours spot on and 100% accurate to the reference photo, but if I don't have my shadows and highlights correct, then it's still going to look flat. So I really want to be making sure that I've captured the contrast, and that's something that I like to build up in stages throughout the layering process. Now at this section of the drawing, this is where the fur had more of a silkier appearance. Now the one way that I felt I was able to capture that more effectively was to first of all really focus on a good base foundation. So as you can see here, I'm coming back in with my pastel pencils and reinforcing that as much as I can with the softness that is achieved. Now one thing as well that also made this look more silky is the fact that I didn't have my base layers too dark. You can see a photo of the drawing in the corner and there's no real dark shadows on that lighter section of fur on the chest. If I were to darken this up too much, then I'm going to lose that softness within the fur. And again, of course, this is something that's going to vary from reference photo to reference photo, but in order to capture the softness for this section, I really did feel like the lighter layers would work best for that. I can darken them up later if I need to, but having those lighter values in here, almost like I've had slightly less contrast, has helped with that silkier appearance. Now as I come back in with my highlights, I'm allowing those layers underneath to provide that softness. I'm still hinting at a high level of realism, but in this case, less details is actually going to make it look better. If I was to force too many individual pencil strokes, I'm going to make that fur texture go from that soft, silky appearance into something that's a little bit more textured. So that is something for that entire lighter part of the chest I wanted to avoid. Now this section of the portrait is a great demonstration of drawing the right layer at the right time. Now I mentioned this a moment ago where I had to finish off the lower part of the chest before I could work on the ear, and this is highlighting that perfectly. If I was to draw the ear first and then try to add in these sections, I'm going to have to work around all of those longer, finer details, which is far more time consuming and really fiddly. So I do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you are interested in drawing along to this real-time tutorial or any of my other step-by-step lessons, I'll link all of the information to that in the description below. If you do have any art-related questions, as I mentioned earlier, feel free to pop them in the comments because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video next week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.